Vladimir Putin's Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg is the second time he's invited African leaders to meet him on home turf. And if attendance is anything to go by, he's more interested in them than they are in him. Last time in Sochi, 45 of them turned up. This time, almost 2/3 of them stayed away. So what is Putin offering? The Russian president has promised to supply African nations free weapons to enhance security on the continent. His country is already Africa's biggest arms dealer. He's also pledged cooperation on trade, science and technology. I'll be talking to an analyst about what all this means after this report.
The Russia-Africa summit is an opportunity for Moscow to tell the world it's not alone and it can still do political business. Consider all that has resulted from the invasion of Ukraine, internationally with an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin for war crimes, and internally with the instability of a failed mutiny by the leader of the Wagner private army. Despite all this, African heads of state fly in when Putin invites them. But why? The former Soviet Union was a pivotal partner to many African states in their fight against colonialism. It provided funding, moral support, and in some cases weapons to independence movements. For Moscow, it was an opportunity to counteract Western influence during the Cold War. Countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Mozambique are still ruled by parties that were supported by the USSR during the liberation struggles. Some former heads of state even studied in Moscow. Some relationships continue to be cozy, especially with South Africa. Russia gave the liberation movement, the ANC, money, weapons and training for the fight against apartheid. The ANC is in government today and it seems has not forgotten. Russia invests very little in Africa. It accounts for only 1% of the foreign direct investment into the continent. And yet, Russia is a major force when it comes to arms. In recent years, Russia has been by far the biggest single exporter of arms to the African continent. It sells more than twice as much to Africa than the US does. These arms sales are seen as giving Russia significant political leverage to its customers. And then there's the mercenary group Wagner. It's active in Mali, Central African Republic, Libya and Sudan, propping up autocratic regimes in exchange for natural resources like gold. It is accused of operating with awful brutality, committing massacres and other human rights abuses. Wagner's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, threatened a rebellion against the Russian leadership at home, but Moscow says Wagner will continue its operations in Africa. Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal has pushed up global food prices. This is expected to hit East Africa the hardest. Ethiopia and Somalia are already gripped by drought, conflict and hunger. Approximately 80% of East Africa's grain is imported from Russia and Ukraine. In Somalia, this figure is 90%.
Africa is suffering. Those were the words of AU Commission Chairman Moussa Faki Mahamat, lamenting that the war between Russia and Ukraine was making Africa's food crisis worse. Responding to African calls asking Kyiv and Moscow to end the conflict, Putin said he'd look at an African peace proposal. The Russian leader rejected as hypocritical accusations by the West that the Kremlin is playing, quote, hunger games. On Thursday, Putin announced free grain supplies to 6 African nations just 10 days after blocking exports from Ukraine by quitting the Black Sea grain deal. And to talk more on Russia relations with Africa, we've invited Amaka Anku onto the program. She is head of Africa practice for Eurasia Group. Amaka joins me from Washington. Welcome to DW News Africa. Amaka, why is Russia giving away grain for free?
What a way to start the conversation, Christine. Look, I think they're doing it because there's a propaganda war that both sides are fighting, and Russia is trying to sort of do its part to promote the narrative that it's not, advancing food insecurity in the global south.
Amaka, let's come back to the summit. We know that only 17 heads of state attended the summit this time, far fewer than the first summit in 2019. Moscow blames the US for putting pressure on African leaders not to attend. What do you make of the fact that most African leaders didn't actually make the trip to Russia and sent representatives instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reflection of the times. In 2019, it was the first summit. There were more African heads of states. Obviously, since the war, we've seen a lot of African countries try to stay neutral. And so there's a perception that, going in person to St. Petersburg, to Russia, might sort of tilt you in one direction or the other. And so that's why many of them are sending representatives. But it's also important to remember that even before the war, Russia has never been a particularly important partner. And so it's not particularly like there's no big leverage there, right?
Right. And perhaps I want to get into how you would characterize the relationship between Vladimir Putin and heads of state in Africa. Is it one of mutual respect?
Yeah. So look, you got to remember it's different depending on the country, right? So for many Southern African countries, the relationship with Russia has historical links. The Soviet Union was one of the only, if not the only country that supported liberation movements with the things that mattered, like guns and weapons and training when they were fighting sort of minority white repressive governments. In West Africa, the relationship is often about, buying cost-effective arms. As you know, there's a lot of jihadist movements and insecurity in the Sahel region, a lot of which was stoked by, the bombing of Libya. And so it's, if you need low-cost arms, Russia is the place to go. And so it really depends. That's been the relationship. In Southern Africa, it's really been one that, the historical goodwill is still there. But across the board, the trading relationship is low. And I would say today, a lot of the relationship is just about keeping options open and also not upsetting China.
So how then would you compare Russia to other big powers like China that you've just mentioned, the US, collective Europe in Africa?
I'd say Russia is at the bottom of the totem pole. China is many of these countries' largest trading partner by far. If you look at South Africa, for example, there's been a lot of focus on South Africa, appearing open to hosting Putin. The reality is that even though many of the people in power in South Africa do have a lot of goodwill towards Russia because Russia supported the ANC's liberation movement, the primary thing that's driving South Africa's foreign policy today is that it's very close to China, right? And so because it's very close to China, it doesn't necessarily want to be seen as just sort of buckling to the West, right? And so that's kind of why it's trying to play this tricky role. I would say it's very similar dynamics in a lot of other countries.
Stand by, Amaka, because I want us to see a report from the Central African Republic. That's where Russia has the strongest and perhaps the most obvious influence. This is due to the private armed group Wagner, which effectively controls the capital city, Bangui, and provides security for the president. Now, as you will also see, Russian influence is even reaching into the Central African Republic's churches. DW's Sigoto Chaya Chameni reports now.
Pour notre patriarche Kirill, patriarche de Moscow.
Regis Sinclair Voyemawa is the Russian Orthodox Church's man in the Central African Republic. He switched his Byzantine Orthodox Church to the Russian version last August. 5 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, that invasion has sharpened international concerns about Russian influence in countries like the Central African Republic, including via institutions like the church. Don't you also think that there is some form of huge Russian influence in the Central African Republic?
The Russians are correcting the mistakes that others have committed, like the French. Russia has never colonized an African country. It must be said that Russia is a great partner in terms of security, especially in our country. We're in the heart of Africa and are threatened by rebels and terrorists. Russia is here and we're at peace. We're happy to have our partnership with Russia.
Regis trained in the Russian Orthodox liturgy in Moscow. His church is sponsored by that church, and soon 2 Central African Republic seminarians will follow him to St. Petersburg for study. It's thought a quarter of people in the Central African Republic's capital, Bangui, are members of the Russian Orthodox Church, converts from the Roman Catholic Church.
I don't feel influenced by the Russians because it is a church that teaches us the truth. And then the liturgical doctrine is good. There are several things that I did not master before. It is now that my eyes begin to open to know the truth and the right path.
Just as Russian private army, the Wagner Group protects President Faustin Archange Touadéra, a statue to its soldiers watches over the center of the capital city. People here in Bangui won't speak critically about Russia's influence or actions. Either they are too scared or they appreciate the relative quiet.
I know that there used to be a Roman Catholic Church and that this church was transformed into a Russian Orthodox Church. And with the presence of this Russian Orthodox Church, we feel that there is a Russian influence in our country. If this influence can bring security, peace and development in our country, then this is what all Central Africans want.
In this country which has lived through decades of wars, this desire for a new beginning is widespread. For those who are not suffering, it matters less who runs security or the churches. Relative stability may be enough.
Amaka, is Russia offering countries like the Central African Republic a solution where other countries have failed?
No. The Wagner presence in countries like the Central African Republic and Burkina Faso and Mali has been primarily about regime security. Okay, by that I mean protecting the governments in power that are not necessarily popular or responsive. It's not necessarily about public security, right? And so I don't think Wagner is necessarily, I don't think Russia is offering something that's particularly valuable. And again, these are outliers. I know, we often tend to kind of characterize the continent by a few, like the outliers, the CAR, the Burkina Faso, the Mali. They're, in my view, a minority, right? The places where most Africans live, the bigger countries just don't have those kinds of relationships. So, I tend to downplay this whole thing and Wagner and Russia. I don't think there's that much that it has to offer, to be honest. And I think that the West should focus on what it does have to offer rather than obsessing about Russia's footprint.
Yeah, and I'm keen to know how you would say Russia is spreading its influence among populations in other African countries where it has vested interests. I mean, we've seen them taking over churches in the Central African Republic. I just wondered how else they would be sort of spreading their influence among populations.
Look, there's always going to be pockets of different things happening. I just don't see any evidence that there is a significant and growing influence of Russia across Africa in the sense of cultural power, right? I see a lot of Africans, when they talk about Russia, it's about just this sense of pushing back against Western hegemony, right? It's not that people are like falling over themselves to go live in Russia, right? Most people still would prefer to live in the US or in the West, right? So I think in terms of cultural influence, if you look at music, technology, much of this stuff is still very heavily influenced by the US, not by Russia. So, I'm skeptical of, overstating Russia's ability to spread cultural influence in the region.
All right, and that's where we'll leave it. Amaka Anku, she is head of Africa Practice for Eurasia, joining us there from Washington. We really appreciate your insights on the program, Amaka. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.